Simon Armitage, born 1963, from Killing Time. 1. Meanwhile, somewhere in the state of Colorado, armed to the teeth with thousands of flowers, two boys entered the front door of their own high school and for almost 4 hours gave floral tributes to their fellow students and members of staff, beginning with red roses strewn amongst unsuspecting pupils during their lunch hour, followed by posies of peas, lilies, and wild orchids. Most thought the whole show was one elaborate hoax, using silk replicas of real things, plastic imitation, exquisite practical jokes. But the flowers were no more fake than you or I, and were handed out as compliments returned, flavors re- favors repaid in good faith, straight from the heart. No would not be taken for a no for an answer. Therefore, a daffodil was stuck behind the ear of a boy in a baseball hat, and marigolds and peonies filled through the hair of those caught on the stairs or spotted along corridors, until every pupil who looked up from the behind a desk could expect to be met with at least a petal, or a dusting of pollen, if not an entire daisy chain, or the colored burst of a dozen foxgloves flowering from all their worth, or a buttonhole to the breast. Upstairs, the school library individuals were singled out for special attention. Some were showered with blossom, others wore their blooms like brooches and medallions. Even those who turned their backs or refused point blank to accept such honors were decorated with buds, unseasonable fruits, and rosettes the same as the others. By which time a crowd had gathered outside the school, drawn through suburbia by the rumor of flowers in full bloom, drawn through the air like butterflies to Buddleia, too, like honeybees to honeysuckle, and like hummingbirds dipping their tongues in. One, in what came to be known as the Columbian Massacre, two seniors of Columbine High School, Colorado, went to school on April 20, 1999, armed with guns, knives, and bombs. At the end of the day, 12 students, one teacher, and two murderers were dead, also known as Butterfly Bush. Two, also known as Butterfly Bush. Some to soak up such over exuberance of thought, others to savor the ongoings, finally overcome by their own munificence or hay fever, the flower boys pinned the last blooms on themselves, somewhat selfishly perhaps, but had also planned. Further surprises for those who swept through the aftermath of Prune and Buttercup. Garlands and bouquets were planted in the lockers and cupboards time to erupt, like the first day of spring, into the arms of those who, during the first bout, either by fate or chance, had somehow been overlooked and missed out. Experts were now trying to say how two apparently quiet kids from an apple pie town could get their hands on a veritable rainforest of plants and bring them down, a whole botanical digest of one species or another, onto the heads of classmates and teachers, and where such fascination began, and why it should lead to an outpouring of this nature. And even though many believe that flowers should be kept in experts' hand, only or left to specialists in the field such as florists and raw of the land. Dictates that God, guts, and gardening made the country what it is today, and for as long as the flower industry can see to the things or staying that way. What they reckon is that deny a person the right to carry flowers of his own, and he is liable to wind up on the business end of a flower somebody else has grown. As for the two boys, it's back to the same old debate: is it somebody in the mind that grows from birth like a seed, or the society makes a person of that kind? The shout. We went out into the school yard together, me and the boy whose name and face I don't remember. We were testing the range of human voice. We had shout for all the he was worth. I had raised an arm from across divide to signal back, and the sound has carried. He called from over the park. I lifted an arm out of bounds. He yelled from the end of the road, from the foot of the hill, from beyond the lookout post of Fritwell's farm. I lifted an arm. He left town, went on to 20 years dead with a gunshot hole in the roof with his mouth, in West Australia. Boy with the name and face I don't remember, you can stop shouting now. I still can hear you. Craig Williamson, born 1964, Outbound. We live life afterwards and think about it back. We live life forwards and think about it backwards. Howard Nemiro, 1. The passengers ride backward on the train and train our eyes on what we has passed by. A coward blur composes into a woman picking roses who is already fading in the pain, as in the failing hindsight of the eye. A line of blue oaks comes into focus, face supplanted by double daggers pose of power companies. Footnotes have redefined the trees, and asterisks in glass, then windows, shades, graffiti, billboards, tattered banderoles, that is, long scrolls, of southbound birds, whatever comes into view, corrects the view but never will explain the random next event. One is American Poet 1920 to 1991, or anything but where we went, where long ago a woman wearing blue began forgetting someone on a train. Page 2024. From double exposures to third, visiting couple kissing in half onion. Unjustly I've imposed upon my friends this it's an onion and it's been cut in half. When there, how shall I making amends? Right in the middle of the photograph, after a night of words, and here they stand, less like those pure textbook transparencies, wrapped up in one another, hand in hand, then layered and opaque identities. An arm around a shoulder, face to face, developed in the dark to this full kit, and captured in this rapturous embrace which has so many tears inside of it. 25. Group photo with winter trees. These were my neighbors. It's a big group pose. On midst gray on mist gray skies, the stark black branches etch horizon, lawn, in loose haphazard roads. As if in tin, or as in some old sketch, that's the great Bob, and that's our good Queen Paul, whose lines, whose every nuance was precise. With Champagne Anne and Rick the dog, they are all but faded now. I've seen the trees in eyes, decked out list too, who helped me do the plumbing. But I'll be gone when there's spring blooms and scatters, even the children, and God, they're all becoming shapes as the new leaves turns to other matters. New Year's, a short poem. 3. The sunlight was falling apart, laid out in the deep snow. We were all there at the start. We knew how the year would go. 2. The title refers to the form invented by Williamson, in which three poems can be read in one: the bold type, the standard type, and the combination. 3. On this verse from C. Verification, page 2046, page 2025. Played out in deep snow, the sunlight was falling apart. We knew how the year would go. We were all there at the start. Page number 2027. Versification. A poem is in a composition written for performance by human voice. What your eyes sees on the page is the composer's verbal score, waiting for your voice to bring it alive as you read it aloud or hear it in your mind's ear. Unlike a reading of a newspaper, the best reading, that is to say, the most satisfying reading of a poem, involves simultaneous engagement of eye and ear. The eye attentive not only to the meaning of the words but to their grouping, spacing, and lines on the page. The ear attuned to the grouping and spacing of sounds. The more you understand of musical notation and principles of musical composition, the more you will understand and appreciate a composer's score. Similarly, more you understand of versification, the principles and practice of writing verse, the more you are likely to understand and appreciate poetry and, in particular, the intimate relationship between its form and its content. What a poem says or means is a result of how it is said. A fact that the poet are often at the pains to emphasize all my life. Said W. H. Auden, I have been more interested in technique than anything else, and T.S. Eliot claimed the conscious problems with which one is concerned in the actual writing are more those of a quasi musical nature, in the arrangement of metric and pattern, than of a conscious exposition of the ideas. Fortunately, the principles of versification are easier to explain than those of musical composition. The oldest classification of poetry into three broad categories still holds. First, epic, a long narrative poem frequently extending to several books, sections of several hundred lines on a great and serious subject. See, for example, Spenser's The Faerie Queene, page 165, Milton's Paradise Lost, page 420, Wordsworth The Prelude, page 781, and Barry Browning Aurora Leigh, page 948. With one notable exception, Mills' The Changing Light at Sandevo, page 1725. The few poems of comparable length to have been written in the 20th centuries. For example, William Patterson's and Pound's Cantus, page 1306, have a freer, less formal structure. Second, dramatic. Poetry, monologue, or dialogue written in the voice of a character assumed by the poet. Species does not permit the inclusion in this anthology of speeches from the many great verse dramas of English literature, but see such dramatic monologues as Tennyson's Ulysses, page 1992, Browning's My Last Touches, page 1012, and Howard's response to that poem, Nicholas Marthurus to his Master Ferdinand, Count of Tyrol, 1565, page 1778. 3. Lyric. Originally a song performed in ancient Greece to the accompaniment of a small harp-like instrument called a lyre. The term is now used for any fairly short poem in the voice of a singular speaker, although that speaker may sometimes quote others. The reader should be wary of identifying the lyric speaker with the poet, since the eye of a poem will frequently be that of a fiction character invented by the poet. The majority of poems in this book are lyrics, and principal types of lyric will be found set out under forms, page 2039. Rhythm. Poetry is most compressed form of language, and rhythm is an essential component of language. When we speak, we hear a sequence of syllables. These, the basic units of pronunciation, can consist of a vowel sound alone, are counted as vowel sounds, as in riddle, riddle, and prism, prism. In words of two or more syllables, one is almost always given more emphasis, or as we say, is more heavily stressed than the others, so that what we hear in ordinary speech is a sequence of such units, variously stressed and unstressed as, for example, a poem is a composition and written for performance by the human voice. We call such an analysis of stressed and unstressed syllables scansion, the action or art of scanning a line to determine its division into metrical feet. And a simple system of sciences has been evolved to donate stressed and unstressed syllables and of any significant pause between them. Adding such scansion marks will produce the following. A poem is a composition written for performance by the human voice. The double bar known as caesura, from the Latin word of cut, indicates a natural pause in the speaking voice which may be short, as here, or long, as between sentences. The sign indicates an unstressed syllable, and the sign indicates one that is stressed. The patterns of emphasis, stress, or accent can vary from speaker to speaker and situation to situation. If someone were to contradict my definition of a poem, I might reply, a poem is a composition written for performance by the human voice, with a heavier stress on is than on any other syllable in the sentence. The signs and make no distinctions between varying levels of stress and unstress, it being left to the reader to supply such variations, but some analysts use the sign to indicate a stress falling between heavy and light. Most people pay little or no attention to the sequence of stress and unstressed syllables in their speaking and writing, but to a poet there may be no or more element of a poem. Page 2029. Meter. If a poem's rhythm is structured into a recurrence of regular, that is, approximately equal units, we call it meter. From the Greek word of measure, for many centuries after its origin or lost in the mists of antiquity, meter was the principal feature of distinguishing poetry from prose. There are four metrical systems in English poetry: the accentual, the accentual syllabic, the syllabic, and quantitative. One of these, the second, accounts for more poems in English language and those anthology than do others three together. Accentual meter, sometimes called strong stress meter, is the oldest. The earliest recorded poem in the language, that is the oldest of English or Anglo-Saxon poems, Seedman's 17th century hymn, page 1, employs a line divided in two by a heavy caesura, each half dominated by two strongly stressed syllables. Here rest you, Elda Burnham. He first created for men's sons, Fafon to Roth, Helix, Siphoned, Heaven as roof, Holy Creator. Here, as in most Old English poetry, each line is organized by stress and by alliteration, the repetition of speech sounds, vowels, or more usually consonants, in a sequence of nearby words. In a line structured by accentual meter, one and generally both of the stress syllables in the first half line alliterate the first stress syllable in second half line. Accentual meter continued to be used in the late 14th century as the Langland's Piers Plowman, page 71, which begins in a summer season, when mild was the sun, I clad myself in clothes as if I'd become a sheep. In a summer season, when soft was the sown, I shop me in shrouds as I sheep were. However, following the Saxons' conquest by the Normans in 1066, Saxon native meter was increasingly supplanted by metrical patterns of Old French poetry brought to England in the wake of William the Conqueror. Although the non-alliterative four-stress line would have long and lively continuing life, structuring, for example, section 2 of Iliads, the dry salvages. The old English metrical system has been occasionally revived in more recent times, as for the Heaney's translation of Beowulf, page 2, or for stress lines of Coleridge's Christabel and Wilbur's Young, page 1638. And many English poets from Spenser and onwards have used alliteration in ways that could recall the character of Old and Middle English words. Accentual syllabic meter provided the metrical structure of the new poetry to emerge in the 14th century, and its base unit was the foot, a combination of two or three stressed or unstressed syllables. The four most commonly metrical feet in English poetry are: first, iambic, the noun is iamb, and unstressed followed by a stressed syllable, as in New York. Between the Renaissance and the rise of free verse, page 2048, in the last century, iambic meter was the dominant rhythm of the English poetry. Considered by many writers in English as well as classical Latin, the uh, meter closest to that of ordinary speech. For this reason, iambic meter is also to be found occasionally in the work of prose writers. Dickens' novel of A Tale of Two Cities, for example, begins, "It was the best of all times, it was the worst of all times." Trochaic. The noun is trochee. A stress followed by an unstressed syllable, as in the word London, or the line from the nursery rhyme, London Bridge is falling down. Here, as in many other trochaic lines, the final unstressed syllable has been dropped. The shortening which gives prominence to the stressed syllable necessary for rhyme, page 2036, is called catalectic line end. The word London may be trochee, but it does not have to appear in a trochaic line. Provided in its nature stress and preserve, it can take its place comfortably in iambic line, like that from Iliad's The Wasteland. A crowd flowed over London Bridge, where iambic meter has certain gravity, making it natural choice for poems and solemn subjects. Trochaic foot was a lighter, quicker, more buoyant movement. Hence, for example, its use in Milton's Liagro lines 25 to 29, for example, on page 403, and Blake's introduction to Songs of Innocence, page 733. 3. An Anapestic. The noun is anapest. 2. Unstressed syllables followed by a stressed syllable, and as in Tennessee, or opening in Byron, the destruction of the Sennacherib. The Assyrian came down like the wolf on the fold. The last three letters of the word Assyrian should be heard as one syllable. One form of contraction as elision. 4. Dactylic. The noun is dactyle. A stressed syllable followed by two unstressed syllables, as in Leningrad. As in Leningrad. This, like the previous triple three-syllable foot, the anipest has naturally energetic movement, making it suitable for poems with vigorous subjects, though not these only. See Hardy's The Voice, page 1160, which begins, page 2031. Women's much missed how you call to me, call to me. Yams and anipest, which have a strong stress on the last syllable are said to constitute a rising meter, whereas trochees and dactyls ending with an unstressed syllable constitute a falling meter. In addition to these four standard metrical units, there are two other two-syllable feet that occur only as occasional variants of the others. Fifth, spondic. The noun is spondi. Two successive syllables with approximately equal strong stresses on the words drawback in the second of these lines from Arnold's Dover Beach. Listen, you hear the grating roar of pebbles which the waves draw back and fling. 6. Pyrrhic. Pyrrhic. The noun is also pyrrhic. Two successive unstressed or lightly stressed syllables, as in the second foot of second line above, where the succession of the light syllables seem to mimic the rattle of the light pebbles that the heavy was wave slowly draws back. Poets who consciously or instinctively will select a media to suit their subject have also a variety of line lengths from which to choose. First, monometer, 1 foot. See the fifth and sixth line of each stanza of the Herbert's Easter Wings, page 368, which reflect in turn the poverty and thinness of the speaker. Herrick's, upon his departure hence, is a rare example of complete poem in iambic monometer. The fact that each line is a solitary foot suggests to the eye the narrow inscription of a gravestone, and to the ear the brevity and loneliness of the life. Thus I pass by and die as one unknown and gone. I made a shade and laid I grave where there have my cave, where till I dwell. Farewell.
Page number 2032 versification. 2. Diameter 2 feet. Iambic diameter alternates with iambic pentameter in tones A. Valediction of weeping B. 300 and dactylic diameter gives Tennyson's The Charge of the Light Brigade P. 1005 its galloping momentum. Cannon to right of them, cannon to left of them, cannon in front of them, volleyed and thundered, stormed at with shot and shell. Boldly they rode and well into the jaws of that, into the mouth of hell, rode the 600. Lines 4 and 9, each lacking a final unstressed syllable, are catalect, a common feature of decatalic as of trocanic poems. Diameter 3 feet. Relax the Lie, page number 154, and Droitic My Papa's Waltz, page 1494, are written in iambic trimeter in all but the last line of each stanza of Shelley's To a Skylark, page 876, in trochaic trimeter. Tetrameter 4 feet. Marvels to his coy mistress, page 478, is written in iambic tetrameter, and Shakespeare's Fear No More That Heats the Sun, page 276, in trochaic tetrameter. Pentameter 5 feet. The most popular metrical line in English poetry, the iambic pentameter provides the basic arithmetical framework or base rhythms of countless poems from the 14th century to the 21st. From Chaucer's Journal Prologue to the Canterbury Tales, page 19, and Shakespeare's Sonnets, page 257, to Hill's Lacrimae, page number 1834, and Skeneck and Burke's Supernatural Love, page 2003. It even contributes to the stately prose of the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Anapaestic pentameter is to be found in Brown's Soul. As the live is discovered Almighty, why be proved that the power that exists without for it of being believed. A missing syllable in the first foot of the second line gives emphasis to the important word power, which Browning, like many 19th century Englishman, but unlike most 21st century Americans, probably pronounced as a single syllable. Hexameter, 6 feet. The opening sonnet of Sydney's Astrophil and Stella, page 213, and Downson's Nonsum Qualis Iram Bonae Sub Regno Scenaria, page 1211, are written in iambic hexameter, a line sometimes known as an Alexander line, probably after a 12th century French poem, The Roman. Page number 2033. The Alexander, a single Alexandrine, is often used to provide a resonant termination to a stanza of a shorter liner, as for example, the Spenserian stanza, page 2042, or Hardy's The Convergence of the Twain, page number 1156, in which the shape of the stanza suggests the iceberg that is the poem suggests subject. Swinburne, The Last Oracle, is written in trocanic hexameter. Day by day thy shadow shines in heaven beholden. 7. Heptameter, 7 feet. Kipling Tommy, page 1181, is written in iambic heptameter, or 14ers as they are often called, from the number of their syllables, with an added initial syllable in 3 of the 4 lines that make up the second half of each sentence. 8. Octameter, 8 feet. Browning, a toccata of Gallopese, page 1017, is the most famous example of the rare trochaic octameter. Poet who write in strict conformity to a single metrical pattern will achieve the music of a metronome soon drive their listener aware. Variation surprise is very essence of every artist's trade, and one of the most important source of metrical power and pleasure is the perpetual tension between the regular and the irregular, between the expected and the unexpected, the bass rhythm and the variation. John Hollander has spoken of the metrical contract that poets enter into with their readers from the first few words of a poem, and first begin the gift outright. The land was ours before we were the land's. We accept we expect what follows to have an iambic bass master, but irregularity of or variation in the fourth would tell us that we are hearing not robot speech but human speech. The style on V makes it appropriately one of the two most important one in the line, V being the most important presence in the land. First poem will serve as an example of ways in which skillful poet will vary their base matter. First, the land was our before we were the lands. Second, she was our land more than 100 years. Third, before we were her people, she was ours. Fourth, in mass acquisite in Virgin Aya. Fifth, but we were in England still colonials. Sixth, possessing what we still weren't possessed by. Seventh, possessed by what we now no more possessed. Eighth, something we were withholding made us weak until we found out that it was ourselves. 10th, we were withholding from our land of living. 11th and 4th, we found salvation in surrender. 12th, such as we were, we gave ourselves outright. Page number 2034. 13, the deed of gift was men by deeds of war. 14, to the land regularly realizing westward. 15, birth still unstirred, heartless, and hands. 16, such as she was, such as she would become. The iambic pentameter gives the poem a stately movement appropriate to the unfolding history of the United States in the Trocaki reverse beat. At the start of line 2, 10, 12, and 16, the state is advanced to lend emphasis to a key word, or in the case of line 8, an important syllable responded in lines to our land and her people. Break into equal balance the two partners whose union is the theme of the poem. Such additional heavy stresses are counterbalanced by the light fabric feet at the end of the line 4 and 5, in the middle of line 10, and toward the line of line 14. The multiple irregularities of that line give a wonderful impression of the land stretching westward into space, just as the variation of line 16 give a sense of the nation surging toward its destiny in time. Frost's reading of this poem at President Kennedy's inauguration differed at the number of points from the above sketched, in that it was more colloquial, less emphatic, but authors cannot control other reading of their work as they control its writing scansions is to some extent a matter of interpretation, in which the Rhetorical emphasis: a particular reader prefers alters the stress pattern. Other readers of the gift outright might no less correctly prefer the following rhetorical variation of the base matter. Seventh, we now, 9, until we found. An important factor in varying the pattern of a poem is the placing of its pauses or caesars. One failing in the one falling in the middle of a line, as in line 4 above, is known as a medical cursor. One falling near the start of a line, an initial cursor, and one falling nearer the end of the line, a terminal cursor. When a cursor occurs, as in lines 13 or 14 above, those lines are said to be end stopped. Lines 3 and 9, however, are called run-on line, or to use a French term, they exhibit enjambment. Are striding over because the thrust of the incomplete sentence carries on over the end of the verse line. Such transitions tend to increase the pace of the poem, as the end stopping lines of 10 through 16 slow it down. A strikingly original and influentially blending of the Old English sequential and more modern sequential syllabic metrical system was sprung rhythm, conceived and pioneered by Gerd Manley Hopkins, finding the cadences of his Victorian contemporaries what he called their common rhythm too measured and mellifluous. For his liking, he sought a stronger, more muscular verse movement strength he equated with stress, arguing that even one stressed syllable may make a foot. Consequently, two or more stresses may come running one after the other, which in common rhythm can regularly speak never happen in his system of sprung rhythm. Each foot begin with a stress and could consist of a single straight syllable, anatogy, anadactyl, or what he called a first person. His lines will on a occasion admit other unstraight syllable, as in the sonnet Felix Randall the farrier, oh, is he dead then? My duty all ended, who have watched this mold of man, big bond and hardy, handsome, pinning, till time when reason trembled in a ransom fatal of for discover, for disorder flesh, there all contendent. A poetry structured on the principle that strength is particularly well suited to stressful subject, and the sprung rhythm of what Hopkins called a terrible sonnet, pp. 1167 to 72, for example, given them a dramatic urgency of sense of agonist struggle that few poets have equaled in sequential syllabic matter. A number of other poets have experimented with two other metrical syllabical matter, measure only the number of syllables in a line without regard to their stress. Being an inescapable feature of the English language, stress will of course appear in lines composed on syllabic principle, but will fall variously and visually for rhetorical emphasis rather than any formal metrical pattern. When Marian Moore wished to attack the pretentiousness of much formal poetry, page 1329, she should choose to do so in syllabics, as lines in syllabic meters are called. The effect is carefully informal and prosaic, and few unalerted readers will notice that there are 19 syllables in the first line of each stanza, 22 in the second, 11 in the third, except for the third line of the third stanza, which has 7, 5 in the fourth, 8 in the fifth, and 13 in the sixth. That the poem succeed in deflating poetry with a capital P, while at once celebrating poetry and creating it, is not to be explained by Moore's talent for arithmetic so much as by her unobtrusive skill in modulating the stresses and pauses of colloquial speech. The result is a music like that of good free verse, page 2048. Because stress plays virtually no role in Romance languages such as French and Italian, and in Japanese, their poetry tend to be syllabic in construction. One Japanese form that has taken root in English poetry on both sides of the Atlantic and beyond is the haiku, a three-line poem of 17 syllables divided 575. The haiku traditionally offers an image from the natural world, a flower, a branch of cherry blossom, and his convention Paul Malden adapts in the series of 110 Hopewell haiku. Good Friday at 3, a swarm of bees sets its heart on an apple tree. Brilliantly, the Irish Roman Catholic grafts on To a form inextricably linked with the Japanese Shinto religion, an image of Christ dying on the cross at 3 in the afternoon on the first Good Friday. Ezra Pound adapted his Japanese form in the poem, whose title is an integral part of the whole. Page number 2036. In a station of the metro, the apparition of these faces in the crowd petals on a wet black bow. The syllable count here 8, 12, 17 bears only a token relation to that of the strict Japanese pattern, but the poem succeeds largely because its internal rhythm. Page 2037. Station metro petals wet crowd bow point up a series of distinct straight label that suggests it as in an impressionist fashion, a series of distinct white faces. Other American masters of this form are Richard Wright, page 1502, and Richard Wilbur, page 1632, whose poem Zia, page 1640, is composed of stanzas of rhymed haiku-like muldoons. A number of modern poets, among them modern Dylan Thomas and Gunn, have written notable poems in syllabic. Their effort to capture the spirit, if not the letter, of a foreign linguistic and poetic tradition may be compared with those of many poets since the Renaissance who have attempted to render Greek and Latin matters into English words, using the fourth mathematical system to be considered here. Quantitative meter, which structures most Greek, Sanskrit, and later Latin poetry, is based on nations of a syllable's quantity's duration in time or its length. This is determined by various conventions of spelling as well as by type of vowel sound it contains. Complexity arise because Latin has more word stress than does ancient Greek, and hence there is often an alignment of stress and quantity in food pattern of later Latin words. This is ironic in light of the efforts on the part of some Renaissance English poets to enable the vernacular English tradition by following classical mathematical models. Although poets like Spencer and Sidney devised elaborate rules for determining the length of the English syllables, according to ancient rules, the theoretical prescriptions often generated poem in which long syllables are in fact strict syllable. Indeed, one defender of quantitative meter in English, Thomas Champion, explicitly recommended a mathematical system aligning stress with quantity. He illustrated his theory with some highly unsuccessful poems such as Rose Cheek Laura, page 280. Although some less pleasing to the ear than to the highly educated eye, others such as those in Sydney's Arcadia work well with remind us that experiment in cultural translation, some more successful than others, have been an enduring part of the English poetic tradition from the Anglo-Saxon era to the present. Rhyme. Rhyme. Ever since the poetry of Chaucer sprang from the fortunate marriage of the Old French and Old English rhyme, the concurrence in two or more lines of the last stressed vowel and of all speech sounds following that vowel has been closely associated with rhythm in English poetry. It is to be found in the early poems and songs of many languages. Most English speaks meet in first and nursery rhymes, many of which involve number 1, 2, buckle my shoe. A fact supporting the theory that rhyme may have had its origin and primitive religious rites and magical, page number 2037. Magical spells from such beginnings. Poetry has been inextricably linked with music. Cardamom Hymen, page 1, and the earliest popular ballads, page 97, were all composed to be sung, and rhyme has been a critical element in the music of poetry. More than any other factor, it has been responsible for making poetry memorable. Its function is a good deal more complicated than may at first appear in thereby associating one rhyme word with another. Poets may introduce a remote constellation of association. They may confirm, question, or an occasion deny the literal meaning of their word. Consider, for example, the opening 8 lines or octave, page 2042 of Hopkins' sonnet God's Grandeur. First, the word is charged with the grandeur of God. Second, it will flame out like shining from the shoe foil. Third, it gathered to a greatness like the ooze of oil. Fourth, crushed why do men then now not rack his road? Fifth, generation have trod, have trod, have trod. Sixth, and all is scared with tread, blared, smeared with toil. Seventh, and wears man's smudge and sheer man's smell the soil. Eight, is bare now, nor can food feel being short. The grand statement of the first line is illustrated not by the grand examples that the opening of lines 2 and 3 seems to promise, but by the surprising smiles of shaken tin foil and olive oil oozing from its base. The down to earthiness and that these objects have in common is stressed by the foil oil. The rhyme will be confirmed by the toil soil of line 6 and 7. At the other end of the cosmic scale, the grandeur of God no less appropriately rhymes with his road, but what of the implicit coupling of grand God and industrial humanity in the ensuring throat short rhymes of line 5 and 8. These rhymes remind Hopkins' reader that Christ too was a walker of hard road, and that the grandeur of God is manifest in the world through which the weary generation tread. Rhymes appearing like this at the end of the line are known as end rhymes, but poets frequently make use of internal rhyme, such as the man of Hopkins line 4, the seared bleared smeared of line 6, or the weird shears of line 7. As a sense, the repetition of identical or similar vowel sound is present in the not rod of line 4. The sonnet also contain two examples of the related sound effect onomatopoeia, sometimes called echoism, a combination of words whose sound seems to resemble the sound it denotes. So is line 3rd and 4th along the slow alternative vowels ooze of oil seem sequenced by the crushing pressure of the highly stressed verb that flows. So too the triple repetition of have told in line 5 seems to echo the thirding boots of the laboring generation. All the rhymes so far discussed have been what is known as masculine rhymes, in that they consist of a single stressed syllable rhyme word in which a stressed syllable is followed by an unstressed syllable. Chiming rhyming are known as feminine rhymes. Single one syllables and double two syllables rhymes are the most common, but triple and even quadruple rhymes are also to be found usually in a comic context like that of Gilbert's. Page number 2038. I am the very model of a modern major journal, page 1144, or Byron's John's John, page 837. But oh, ye lords of ladies, intellectual informers, truly have they not handpicked you all? If the correspondence of rhyming sound is exact, it is called perfect rhyme, or else full or true rhyme. For many centuries, almost all English writers of serious poem confined themselves of rhymes of this sort, except for an occasional poetic license or violation of the rules of versification, such as I rhymes, words whose ending are spelled alike and in most instances were pronounced alike, but have in the course of time acquired a different pronunciation, proof, love, dotted, blotter, laughter. Since the 19th century, however, an increasing number of poets have failed the confident kinds of perfect rhyme inappropriate for poem of doubt, frustration, and grief, and have used various forms of imperfect rhyme, including off rhyme, also known as half rhyme, near rhyme, or slant rhyme. Difference from perfect rhyme in changing the vowel sound and or the concluding consonant expected of perfect rhyme. See Byron's Gone Alone rhyme in the second stanza of On This Day I Complete My 36th Year, page 1862. Or Dickinson's of rhymings of room, storm, form, broom, and be flying. I heard a fly buzz when I did. Page 1121. Vowel rhyme goes beyond of rhyme to the point at which rhyme word have only their vowel sound in common. See, for example, the muted but musically effective rhymes of Dylan Thomas Fern Hill, page 1571. Boat, towns, green leaves, cherry, barley, climb, eyes, light. Pararhymes, in which the stressed vowel sound the different but are flanked by identical or similar consonant, is a term coined by Edmund Blunden to describe Wilfred Owen's pioneering use of such rhyme, although they had occurred on occasion before. See trot trade in lines 5 and 6 of God Grandeur. Owen was the first to employ pararhymes consistently in a poem such as Stranger Meeting, page 1389. The second rhyme is usually lower in pitch, has a deeper vowel sound, and the first producing effect of dissonance, failure, and fulfillment that subtly reinforce own theme. The last stanza of his minor shows a further refinement. The centuries will burn rich loads with which he grown wood, whose warmth shall lull their dreaming lates, while songs are crooned, but they will not dream of us poor lads left in the ground. Here the pitch of the pararhyme rises to reflect the dream of a happier future. Loads leads before plunging to the desolate reality of lads arise and a fall repeated in grown crooned ground. The effect of rhyming whether the chime is louder. Muted is to a large extent dictated by one rhyme's distance from another, a factor frequently dictated by the rhyme scheme of the poet chosen stanza from. At 1. Page number 2039. Extreme stanza. Monorhyme, a poem of no predetermined meter line, length or number of line, the sole requirement being it one rhyme. The greater the length of a monorhyme, the greater the difficulty of achieving the conversational fluency and ease of dictavis. Monorhyme for the shower lifting her arms to soap her hair, her pretty breast respond, and there the movement of that buoyant pair is like a spell to make me swear. 20 odd years have turned to air, now she is the girl I did not dare approach, ask out, much less declare my love to mired in a despair. Childbearing rose domestic care, all the thoracic wear and tear that constitute the life were sheer, slip from her beautiful and bare bright body as made half aware of my quick surreptitious stare. She wrings the water from her hair and turning smile to see me there. At the other end of the spectrum of rhyme stand Paul Muldoon's use of the same or virtually the same the rhyme of the 90-line poem Third Epistle to Timothy, page 1981, in the same order in four other 90-line poems. Yarrow in Cantata, the Mudroom, the Bangle, Slight Return. Only marginally less remarkable is Dylan Thomas' author's prologue, a poem of 102 lines in which line 1 rhymes with the line 102, line 2 with 101, and so on down to the central couples of line 5152. Rhyme schemes, however, are seldom too taxing to offer poets or their readers, and as with their choice of meter, are likely to be determined consciously or subconsciously by their knowledge of earlier poem written in that or that forms. Basic form. Having looked at and listened to the ways in which metrical feet combine in a poetic line, one can move on to see on here how such lines combine in a larger pattern of the dance, what are known as the form of poetry. Blank verse at the end of the scale consists of unrhymed, hence black iambic pentameter introduced to England by Sir Surrey in his translation from the Ind. It soon became the standard meter for Elizabethan poetic drama. No words from it, closer to the natural rhymes of spoken English or more adapted to different levels of speech, following the example. Page number 2040. Of Shakespeare's whose king, clown, and country folk have each other own voice when speaking blank verse. It has been used by dramatists from Marlowe to Eliot. Milton chose it for his religious epic Paradise Lost, page 420. Wordsworth for his autobiographical epic The Preludes, page 781, and Col- Coleridge for his meditative lyric Frost at Midnight, page 810. During the 19th century, it became a favorite form of dramatic monologues, such as Tennyson's Ulysses, page 992, and Browning Fra Lippo Lippi, page 1026, in which a single speaker who is not the poet addresses a dramatically define listener in a specific situation and at a critical moment. All of these poems are divided into verse paragraph of varying length and as distinct from the stanza of equal length that make up Tennyson's Tears Idly Tears, 5, page number 995, or Stephen Sunday Morning, page 1257. The couplet, two lines of verse usually coupled by rhyme, has been a principal unit of English poetry since rhyme entered the language. The first of the anonyms 13th and 14th century lyrics in the anthological, page 15, in the couplets, but the first poet to use the form consistently was Chaucer, whose journal prologue to the Canterbury Tales, page 19, exhibits great flexibility. His narrative momentum trends to overrun line ending, and his pentameter couplets are seldom to self-contained synthetic units. One finds in Johnson's On My First Son, page 323, the sustained use of such close couplets attained its ultimate sophistication in what come to be known as heroic couples. Heroic because of their use in epic poems or plays, printed by Denham in the 17th century and perfected by Dryden and Pope in the 18th. The Chaucerian energies of the iambic pentameter were ringed in, and each couplet made a balanced whole within the greater balanced whole of its poem. Make Flecknoe, page 517, the example or the rape of the log, page 604, as if in reaction against the elevated heroic or mock heroic diction and syntactic formality of the heroic couplet. More recent uses of the couplet have tended to veer toward the other extreme of informality, colloquialism, frequent enjambment, and variable placing of the caesura mask, the formal rhyming of drawing. My last touch is page 1012 as the speaker of that diametrical monolith seeks to mask a diabolical organization owing with the pararhymes of strange meeting, page 1389, and eats with the off-rhyme tetrameter of underbean bulbin, page 1208, achieves similarly informed effect. Third, the tercet is a stanza of free line traditionally linked with the single rhyme, although the tractates of William's poem, page 1275, and those of some other modern poets are unrhymed. It may also be a three-line section of a larger poetic structure, as for example, the sestet of a sonnet, page 2042. Tercets can be composed of lines of equal length. Iambic pentameter in Herrick's Upon Julia's Close, page 359, or trochaic octameter in Browning, a toccata of column P, page 1017, or of different length, as in Hardy's The Convergence of the Twin, page 1156. An important variant of this form is the linked Taricton terza rima, in which the second line of each stanza rhymes with the first line and third line of the next. A group of such stanzas is commonly concluded with the final line supplying the missing rhyme, as in Wilbur's first Snow in Alsace, page 1632. Although Shelley expanded the conclusion to a couplet in his Ode to the West Wind, page 872, no words form in English. Page number 2041. Poetry is more closely identified with its inventor than its terza rima with Dante, who used it for his Divine Comedy. Shelley invokes the inspiration of his great predecessor in choosing the form for his ode. The written on the outskirts of Dante, Florence, and T.S. Eliot similarly calls the Divine Comedy to mind, with the tercets unrhymed but aligned on the page like Dante of a peasant part 2 of Little Gliding that end form. From wrong to wrong, the exasperated spirit proceed unless and restored by that refining fire, where you must move in measures like a dancer. The day was breaking in the disfigured street. He left me with a kind of valediction and faded on the blowing of the horn. 4. The quatrain, a stanza of 4 lines rhymed or unrhymed, is the most common of all English standing form, and the most common type of quatrain is the ballad stanza, in which line of iambic tetrameter alternate with iambic trimeter rhyming A B C B, lines 1 and 3 being unrhymed or less commonly A B A B. This the stanza of popular ballads such as Sir Patrick Spence, page 103. Coleridge's literally ballad The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, page 812, and Dickinson's I Felt a Funnel in My Brain, page 1115, also occurs in many hymns and is there called common meter. The expansion of lines 2 and 4 to tetrameter produce a quatrain known particularly in hymn book as long meter, the form of Hardy's channel firing, page 1157. When on the other hand the first line is shortened to a trimeter matching line 2 and 4, the stanza is called short meter. Gascoigne uses it for an if I did what then, page 144, and Hardy uses it for I look into my glass, page 1153. Stanza of iambic pentameter rhyming AB as in Gray's Elegy riding in a country churchyard, page 669, are known as heroic quatrains. The pentameter stanza of Fitzgerald's Rubaiyat of Umar Khayyam of Neshpur, page 961, are rhymed AABA, a rhyme scheme that first elaborates in stopping by woods on a snowy evening, page 1237, where the third line unrhymed in the Rubaiyat rhymes with line 1, 2, and 4 of the following stanza, producing an effect like that of terza rima. Quatrains can also be in monorhyme, as in Rossetti's The Wood Spurge, page 1105, composed of two couplets, as in Now Go Sun Underwood, page 15, or rhyme double as in Tennyson's In Memoriam AHHP 996. Fifth, rhyme royal, a 7-line iambic pentameter stanza rhyming AABB, ABABBCC, was introduced by Chaucer in Troilus and Preside, page 67, but its name is thought to come from its later use by King James I of Scotland in the King's Square letter. Example include Wire the Flee off from me, page 127, and those somber stanza in Auden the Shield of Archleys, page 1479, that describe the 20th century as a contrast to the 8-line stanza with the ballad rhythm that describe a methodic past. Sixth, Ottava Rima is an 8-line stanza as its Italian name indicates at its rhyme AB, ABCC, like Torza Rima and the sonnet below. It was introduced to English literature by Sir Thomas Wyatt. Byron put it to brilliant use in Don Juan, page 837, frequently undercutting with a comic couplet to seem, page number 2042. In seeming seriousness of the six preceding line, Yeats used Ottava Rima more gravely in Sailing to Byzantium, page 119, and Among School Children, page 12007. The Spenserian stanza has 9 lines, the first 8 line being iambic pentameter and the last an iambic hexameter and Alexandrine, rhyming A B A B B C B B C C. Chaucer had used two such quatrains like by 3 rhymes as the stanza form of the Monk's Tale, but Spencer edition of a concluding Alexandrine gave the stanza he devised for the Fiery Queenie, page 165, an inequality in its final couplet, a variation reducing the risk of monotony that can overtake a long series of iambic pentameter. Keats and Hopkins wrote their earliest known poem in this form. The Keats went on to achieve perhaps the fullest expression of an intricate harmonies in the Eve of State Agnes, page 907, partly no doubt in tribute that poem. Shelley used the Spenserian stanza in his great elegy for Keats' Adonais, page 879. Later, the form was a natural choice for the narcotic narrative of Tennyson's The Lotos Eaters, page 988. Ottava Rima and the Spenserian stanza each open with a quatrain and close with a couplet. These another of the shorter stanzic units similarly recurs as component parts of certain lyrics with a fixed form. 8. The sonnet, traditionally a poem of 14 iambic pentameter linked by an intricate rhyme scheme, is one of the oldest verse form in English, used by almost every notable poet in the language. Is the best example of how rhyme and meter can provide the imagination not with a prison but with all three others. The sonnet originated in Italy and since being introduced to England by Sir Thomas Wyatt. See his Who's List to Hunt, page 126. In the early 16th century has been the stage for the soliloquies of countless lovers and for dramatic action ranging from a dinner party, page 1108, to the rape of Leda and the fall of Troy, page 1200. There are two basic types of sonnet, the Italian or the Petrarchan, named after the 14th century Italian poet Petrarch, and the English or Shakespearean, and the number of a variant type of which of the most important in the Spenserian. They are different in their rhyme scheme and consequently their structure as shown on page 2043. The Italian sonnet, with its distinctive division into octave on 8-line unit and sestet, a 6-line unit, is strictly suited to the statement followed by the counter statement, as in Milton's When I Consider How My Light is Spent, page 418. The blind poet questioning of divine injustice is checked by the voice of patient, whose has to prevent that murmur is conveyed by the accelerated turn change in direction of argument narrative on the word, but in the last line of the octave rather than the first of the sestet. Shelley's Ozymandias, page 870, follows the same pattern of statement and counter statement, except that its turn comes in the traditional position under pattern common to the Italian sonnet: observation, octave, and amplifying conclusion. Sestet Adeline Keats on first looking into Champions comes, page 905, and Hill's The Laurel X, page 1835. Of these, only Milton's has a set conforming to the conventional rhyme scheme.
The English sonnet falls into three quatrains. with a turn at the end of line 12 and a concluding couplet, often of a summary or epigrammatic character. M.H. Abrams has well described the unfolding of Drayton's "Since there's no help, come let us kiss" in part. P.238. In quotes, the lover brusquely declares in the first two quatrains that he is glad the affair is cleanly broken off, pauses in the third quatrain as though at the threshold, and in the last two rhymed lines suddenly drops his swagger to make one last plea. In quotes, Spenser, in the variant form that bears his name, reintroduced to the English sonnet the couplets characteristic of the Italian sonnet. The interweaving of the quatrains, as in Sonnet 75 of his Amorotti, P.194, makes possible a more musical and closely developed argument and tends to reduce the sometimes excessive assertiveness of the final couplet. That last feature of the English sonnet is satirized by Brooke in his Sonnet Reversed, which turns romantic convention upside down by beginning with the couplet, "Hand trembling towards hand, the amazing lights of heart and eye, they stood on the supreme heights." The three quatrains that follow record the ensuing anticlimax of suburban married life. Meredith in Modern Love, P.111107, stretched the sonnet to 16 lines. Hopkins cut it short in what he termed his curtail, a curtailed form of curtailed. Sonnet, Pied Beauty, P.1167, while Shakespeare concealed a sonnet in Romeo and Juliet. Shakespeare's 154 better-known sonnets form a carefully organized progression, or sonnet sequence, following the precedent of earlier sonneteers such as Sidney with his Astrophil and Stella, and Spenser with his Amoretti, P.190. In the 19th century, Elizabeth Barrett Browning's Sonnet from the Portuguese, P.947, continued a tradition in which the author of Berryman's sonnet has since, with that title, audaciously challenged the author of Shakespeare's sonnet. The 20th century saw the introduction to English poetry of a Russian sonnet, the stanza form of Alexander Pushkin's verse novel Eugene Onegin, 1823-31. This was successfully translated, preserving its original form, by Sir Charles Johnston in 1977, but it was not until 1986 that the Pushkinian stanza first entered English poetry in its own right in Vikram Seth's verse novel, The Golden Gate, P.1994. Arguably the most technically demanding of all the English poetic forms, the Pushkinian stanza is composed of 14 tetrameter, not pentameter, lines rhyming as follows. A. Feminine rhyme, P.2037. B. Masculine rhyme, P.2037. A. Feminine, B. Masculine, C. Feminine, C. Feminine, D. Masculine, D. Masculine, E. Feminine, F. Masculine, F. Masculine, E. Feminine, G. Masculine, G. Masculine. The villanelle, a French verse form derived from an earlier Italian folk song, retains the circular pattern of a peasant dance. It consists of 5 tercets rhyming ABA, followed by a quatrain rhyming ABAA, with the first line of the initial tercet recurring as the last line of the second and fourth tercets, and the third line of the initial tercet recurring as the last line of the third and fifth tercets, these two refrains lines of regular recurrence being again repeated as the last 2 lines of the poem. If A1 and A2 may be said to represent the first and third lines of the initial tercet, the rhyme scheme of the villanelle will look like this. Tercet 1, colon, A1B, A2, 2 colon ABA1, 3 colon ABA2, 4 colon ABA1, 5 colon ABA2, quatrain colon ABA1, A2. The art of writing complicated forms like the villanelle and sestina is to give them the graceful momentum of good dancing, and the vitality of the dance informs triumphant examples such as the Roetex, the Waking, p. 1500, Bishop's One Art, p. 1527, and the Thomases Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night, p. 1572. The sestina, the most complicated of the verse forms, initiated by the 12th century wandering singers known as the troubadours, is composed of 6 stanzas or 6 lines each, followed by an envoy or concluding stanza that incorporates lines or words used before. In this case, the words, instead of rhymes, end each line in the following pattern. Stanza 1, colon, A, B, C, D, E, F, stanza 2, colon, F, A, E, B, D, C, stanza 3, colon, C, F, D, A, B, E, stanza 4, colon, E, C, B, F, A, D, stanza 5, colon, D, E, A, C, F, B, stanza 6, colon, B, D, F, E, C, A, envoy, colon, E, C, A or A, C, E. These lines should contain the remaining 3 end words. The earliest example in this anthology is, in fact, a double sestina. Sydney's Ye Gothard Gods, p. 208. Perhaps daunted by the intricate brilliance of this, few poets attempted the form for the next 3 centuries. It was reintroduced by Swinburne and Pound, who prepared the way for notable contemporary examples such as Bishop's Sestina, p. 1520, Hecht's The Book of Yolek, 1566, and Ashbery's The Painter, p. 1736. The canzon, another verse form initiated by the 12th century troubadours, has a history of varying lengths and patterns. It often consists of the 5 12-line stanzas and a 5-line envoy, all employing the same 5-line end words. A common pattern of repetition is that followed, with minor variations, by Agha Shahid Ali's Lenox Hill, p. 1959, colon, A B A C A D A E slash E A E B E C E D slash D E D A D B C slash C D C E C A C B slash B C B D B E B A slash A B C D E. The pantoum, a Malayan form in origin, entered in English poetry by way of 19th century French poetry. It may consist of any number of quatrains, lines 2 and 4 of which are repeated as lines 1 and 3 in the next quatrain. The poem rhymes A B slash B C and so on, and generally ends with a quatrain whose repetants, that is, repeated lines, are lines 1 and 3 of the first stanza in reversed order, or in a repetant couplet consisting of lines 1 and 3 of the first stanza in reversed order. See Donald Justice's Pantoum of the Great Depression and Greg Williamson's New Year, a short pantoum, p. 2024. The limerick to end this section on the first of 2 light notes is a 5-line stanza thought to take its name from an old custom at convivial parties, whereby each person was required to sing an extemporized nonsense verse, which was followed by a chorus containing the words, "Will you come up to limerick?" The acknowledged old master of the limerick is Edward Lear, p. 1041. Who required that the first and fifth lines end with the same word, usually a place name, a restriction abandoned by many modern masters, though triumphantly retained by the anonymous author of this. colon, there once was a man from Nantucket who kept all his cash in a bucket. But his daughter named Nan ran away with the man, and as for the bucket, Nantucket. The Claryhugh, named after its inventor, Edmund Claryhugh Bentley, 1875 to 1956, is a short comic or nonsensical poem about a famous person consisting of two rhymed couplets with lines of unequal length. Some of the best are to be found in W.H. Auden's academic graffiti. For this, for example, John Milton never stayed in a Hilton hotel, which was just as well. Composite forms. Just as good poets have always varied their bass rhythm, there have always been those ready to bend, stretch, or in some way modify a fixed form to suit the demands of a particular subject. The earliest systematic and successful pioneer of such variation was John Skelton, who gave his name to what has come to be called Skeltonic verse. His poems typically see, for example, the extract from Colin Clout, p.92, have short lines of anything from 3 to 7 syllables containing 2 or 3 stresses, though more of both are common, and exploit a single rhyme until inspiration and the resources of the language run out. The breathless urgency of this form has intrigued and influenced modern poets such as Graves and Auden. Another early composite form employed longer lines, iambic hexameter, 12 syllables, alternating with iambic heptameter, 14 syllables. This form, known as Poulter's measure, from the poultryman's practice of giving 12 eggs for first dozen and 14 for the second, was used by 16th century poets such as Yacht, p. 126, Queen Elizabeth I, p. 142, and Sydney, p. 208, but has not proved popular since. The element of the unexpected often accounts for much of the success of poems in a composite form such as Donne's The Sun Rising, p. 295. His stanza might be described as a combination of two quatrains, the first rhyming A-B-B-A, the second C-D-C-D, and a couplet E. That description would be accurate but inadequate in that it takes no account of the variation in line length, which is a crucial feature of the poem structure. It opens explosively with the outrage of the interrupted lover. Busy old fool, unruly son, why dost thou thus, through windows and through curtains, call on us? Short lines, tetrameter followed by diameter, suggest the speaker's initial shock and give place as he begins to recover his composure to the steadier pentameters that compete the first quatrain. Continuing irritation propels the brisk tetrameters that form the first half of the second quatrain. This again is completed by calmer pentameters, and the stanza rounded off like an English sonnet with the summary pentameter couplet. Love, all alike, no season knows nor clime, nor hours, days, months, which are the rags of time. This variation in line length achieves a different effect in the third stanza, where the brief trimeter suggests an absence contrasting with the royal presences in the preceding tetrameter. She's all states and all princes. I, nothing else is. All these lines prepare both rhetorically and visually for the contraction and expansion so brilliantly developed in the poem's triumphant close. Similar structural considerations account for the composite stanza forms of Arnold's The Scholar Gypsy, p. 1089, and Lowell's Skunk R, p. 1601, though variations of line length and rhyme scheme between the 6-line stanzas of Lowell's poem bring it close to the line that divides composite form from the next category. Irregular forms. A poet writing in irregular form will use rhymes in meter but follow no fixed pattern. A classic example is Milton's Lycidas, p. 410, which is written in iambic pentameters interspersed with an occasional trimeter, probably model on the occasional half lines that intersperse the hexameters of Virgil's Aeneid. Milton's rhyming in this elegy, a formal lament for a dead person, is similarly varied, and a few lines are unrhymed. The most extensive use of irregular form is to be found in one of the three types of ode. Long lyric poems of elevated style and elaborate stanzaic structure, the original odes of the Greek poet Pindar, were modeled on songs sung by the chorus in Greek drama. The three-part structure of the regular Pindaric ode has been attempted once or twice in English, but more common and more successful has been the irregular Pindaric ode, which has no three-part structure but sections of varying length and varying line length and varying rhyme scheme. Each of the Pindar's ode was written to celebrate someone, and celebration has been the theme of many English Pindaric odes, among them Dryden's A Song for St. Cecilia Days. P. 524, Tate's Ode to the Confederate Dead, P. 147, and Lowell's The Quaker Graveyard in Nantucket, P. 1592. The desire to celebrate someone or something has also prompted most English odes of the third type, those modeled on the subject matter, tone, and form of the Roman poet Horace. More meditative and restrained than the boldly irregular Pindaric ode, the Horatian ode is usually written in a repeated stanza form. Marvell's an Horatian ode upon Cromwell's return from Ireland, P. 486 in quatrains, for example, and Keats' To Autumn, P. 939, in a composite 11-line stanza. Open forms or free verse. At the opposite end of the formal scale from the fixed forms, or as they are sometimes called, closed forms of sonnet, villanelle, and sestina, we come to what was long known as free verse, poetry that makes little or no use of traditional rhyme and meter. The term is misleading, however, suggesting some less thoughtful champions of open forms, as free verse structures are now increasingly called a false analogy with political freedom as opposed to slavery, and suggesting to traditionalist opponents the disorder or anarchy implied by Frost's famous remark that writing free verse is like playing tennis with the net down. There was much unprofitable debate in the last century over the relative merit and relevance of closed and open forms. Unprofitable because, as will be clear to any reader of this anthology, good poems continue to be written in both. It would be foolish to wish that Larkin wrote like Whitman or Atwood like Dickinson. Poets must find forms and rhymes appropriate to their voices. When, around 1760, Smart chose an open form for Jubilate Agno, P. 678, that incantatory catalogue of the attributes of his cat Geoffrey proclaimed its descent from the King James translation of the Hebrew scriptures, and specifically such parallel cadences as those of Psalm 150, Praise ye the Lord, praise God in his sanctuary, praise him in the firmament of his power. Praise him for his mighty acts, praise him according to his excellent greatness, praise him with the sound of trumpet, praise him with the psaltery and harp. These rhythms and rhetorical repetitions, audible also in Blake's prophetic books, resurfaced in the work of the 19th century founder of American poetry as we know it today. Whitman's Elegy for an Unknown Soldier, Vigil Strange 1, kept on the field one night, P. 1071, may end up with a traditional image of the rising, like Milton's Lycidas, P. 410, but its cadences are those of the Hebrew scriptures he read as a boy, and there and then and bathed by the rising sun. My son in his grave, in his rude dug grave I deposited, ending my vigil strange with that, vigil of night and battlefield dim, vigil for boy of responding kisses, never again on earth responding. Vigil for comrades swiftly slain, vigil I will never forget, how as day brightened, I rose from the chill ground and folded my soldier well in his blanket and buried him where he fell. Whitman's breakaway from the prevailing poetic forms of his time was truly revolutionary, but certain traditional techniques he would use for special effect, the concealed well/fell rhyme that gives his elegy its closing chord, for example, or the bounding anapaests of an earlier line. One look I but gave, which your dear eyes returned, with a look I shall never forget. The poetic revolution that Whitman initiated was continued by Pound, who wrote of his predecessor. Colin, it was you that broke the new wood. Now is the time for carving. Pound, the carver, unlike Whitman, the pioneer, came to open forms by way of closed forms, a progression reflected in the first four sections of Pound's partly autobiographical portrait of the artist Hugh Salvin Moberly, P. 1298. Each section is less literary, less formal than the last. Quatrains with two rhymes yielding to quatrains with one rhyme, and in section 4 to Whitmanian free verse. A similar progression from the mastery of closed forms to the mastery of open forms can be seen in the developments of poets such as Laurence Eliot, Auden, Lowell, Rich, and Plath, pp. 1284, 1340, 1465, 1592, 1791, 1836, respectively. Pound may have called himself a carver, but he too proved a pioneer, opening up terrain that has been more profitably mined by his successor than the highlands the rolling cadences explored by Smart, Blake, and Whitman. Pound recovered for poets territory then inhabited only by novelists, the low ground of everyday speech, a private rather than a public language. He was aided by Williams, who, in a poem such as The Red Wheelbarrow, used the simplest cadences of common speech to reveal the extraordinary nature of ordinary things. Colin. So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater beside the white chickens. Each line depends upon the next to complete it, indicating the interdependence of things in the poem and by extension in the world. The red wheelbarrow bears out the truth of Auden's statement that in free verse you need an infallible ear to determine where the lines should end. Other forms of poetry. Probably no century of the 60s, since people began writing, saw more experimentation in the arts generally and in poetry particularly than the last. The 20th century pioneers of what came to be known as the confessional, imagist, language, and objectivist schools of poetry defined these modes by aesthetic and philosophic criteria rather than by any distinct formal characteristic that would qualify them for inclusion in this essay. By contrast, the 20th century witnessed the development of at least 5 other categories of experimental poetry that can be defined by their formal characteristics. First, prose poetry. Originated in 19th century France, reaching perhaps its highest point in the work of Charles Baudelaire and Arthur Rimbaud. Prose poem may have any or all the features of the lyric, except that it is set out on the page for the eye, though not the ear, as prose. Hill's Mercian hymns may look like prose, but the poet insists that his lines are to be printed exactly as they appear on pp. 1833 to 1834, and the reader's ear will detect musical cadences no less linked and flowing than in good free verse, with which prose poetry has much in common. Second, found poetry, a 20th century offshoot of prose poetry, converts a passage or passages of someone else's prose from a novel, newspaper, even an advertisement into a poem. This may involve some modification like that described, for example, in Brown Jones' footnote to his poem Common Sense, p. 1829. Shade poetry has a distinguished lineage extending from ancient Greece to modern England and America. Eye and ear together are never more dramatically engaged than in the readings of shade poems such as Herbert's Easter Wings, p. 368, Hollander's Swan in Shadow, p. 1775, and Korn's A Conch from Sicily, p. 1930. Fourth, concrete poetry is an exception to the generalization at the start of this essay. A poem is a composition written for performance by the human voice. All generalizations are false, as the French say, including this one. The term concrete poetry was coined by a group of Brazilian poets in 1952 to cover a loose category of verbal explorations by avant-garde artists and poets around the world. These range from ingenious typographic structures that, unlike the shaped poems mentioned above, cannot be voiced. Mahon's The Window, P. 1923, for example, to Jonathan Williams' Three Ripples in Tuckasegee River, which can. Colin. TSI, KSI, TSI, KSI, TSI, KSI, TSI, KSI, TSI. The poet's note to this say, TSI, KSI, TSI is a Cherokee onomatopoeia for the sound of running water. Fifth, sound poetry, extending the latter, more abstract form of concrete poetry into the count of music, which has been called the ultimate performance poetry. Its performative nature is engagingly demonstrated by Edwin Morgan's poem Interview, which begins, "When did you start writing sound poetry?" Suggestions for further reading. Poets have been making poems for as long as composers have been making music or carpenters' furniture, and just as it would be unreasonable to expect to find the lore and language of music or carpentry distilled into one short essay, so there is more to be said about the making and appreciating of poems than is said here. The fullest treatment of the subject is to be found in a History of the English Prosody from the 12th century to the present day by George Sainsbury, 3 volumes. New York, 1906 to 10, and the Princeton Encyclopedia of Poetry and Poetics, edited by Alex Preminger, Frank J. Warnick, and O.B. Hardison Jr., Princeton, 1965. More suitable for students are The Making of a Poem, a Nortonanthology of Poetic Forms, edited by Mark Strand and Evan Boland, New York, 2000. The Poem's Heartbeat by Alfred Kohn, Ashland, 1997. An Introduction to English Poetry by James Fenton, London and New York, 2022. Poetic Meter and Poetic Form by Paul Fussell, New York, 1965. The Structure of Verse, edited by Harvey Gross, New York, 1966. Revised, 1979. Rhymes Reason, A Guide to English Verse by John Hollander, New Haven, 1981, etc. Poetic Syntax. In Alexander Pope's The Rape of the Lock, there is a line few native speakers of English can grasp on first reading. "Gainst Pallas Mars, Latona, Hermes arms." What do we make of such a line, which is punctuated as a self-contained unit of thought? And why does it occur in the work of a poet renowned for his elegance and clarity of expression? The answer, or at least one answer, is that Pope is using poetic syntax to mimic the hurried confusion that soldiers experience in battle, describing a moment when 2 pairs of Greek gods are arming themselves to fight each other, as related in Homer's Iliad. Pope adapts a classic syntactic pattern with the Greek name zeugma for his own poetic purposes. Zeugma occurs when a single verb governs several parallel words or clauses, verbal units discussed below on P. 2056. Using a pattern that some but not all of his English speaker readers would have recognized, Pope makes densely compressed lines that slows any reader down, impeding easy comprehension. But perhaps that is part of Pope's aim as he constructs a linguistic analog for certain aspects of the imagined battle scene. In so doing, Pope uses syntax not only to communicate ideas but also to create certain dramatic and meaningful effects by the very structure of his lines. What is syntax? Syntax has been defined in many ways. We can begin our own inquiry into the theory of various historical practices of poetic syntax by saying that it concerns transactions between poets and their audiences, readers and listeners, about the meanings of certain sequences of words. The meanings emerge as words unroll in time and also if you are reading the poem in space. But meaning is also a function of how words and groups of words hark back to earlier ones, sometimes to the effect of suspending or even contesting time's forward motion. The word syntax, from the Greek word syn, which means together, and tax, which means to arrange, denotes the orderly or systematic arrangements of part or elements. At the most general level, these elements involve symbols, including mathematical ones that are arranged to create prepositions or statements. The symbols that matter most for poetic syntax are words or group of words, but punctuation marks, line shapes, Stanza form, metrical schemes, and rhyme patterns are also important for understanding poetic syntax as an arrangement of word that generates meaningful statements.
Page number 2054. Poetic syntax. When we are discussing poetry, syntax may refer either to actual arrangements of words or to the rules of grammar and conventions of word order that are reflected, but also sometimes challenged. In such arrangements, we usually think of rule as governing behavior and syntactic rules to govern the behavior of statements in various languages. In the domain of poetry, however, notions about governance, obedience, and order often exist in counterpoint to notions about the aesthetic as well as the social values of poetic license. Poetic syntax, therefore, is a slippery and even in some ways a contradictory topic. For while we are thinking about syntax as an orderly arrangement of verbal elements, according to the conventions of particular language, we also need to be thinking about poetic syntax as the making of significant disorder within a language, and often with allusions to other languages, and their rules or practices of syntax. We can highlight a paradox inherent in any attempt to define poetic syntax by comparing poetic syntax to a game with complex rules that include, under certain circumstances, the option to break the rules. Poets have played the syntactic game for a long time, often in competition with each other as well as with real and imagined audiences. In the game, some syntactic rules have changed, but many retain signs of the close historical links between English and Latin, two very different languages that nonetheless share many words as well as many of the defining what constitutes syntactical correctness. For students of poetic syntax, the most important difference between English and Latin is that in English, meaning depends on certain words being neighbors to one another, whereas in Latin, proximity and distance between words matters little for understanding most written statements. In Latin, a highly inflected language, ending of words, suffixes, tell us a great deal about which word is given statement go with which other words. The ending of nouns, adjectives, and verbs change, are inflected according to their function in a given statement. English is much less inflected language, although certain words need to agree with each other, as is true in Latin and many other languages too. Singular nouns take singular verbs. For instance, in English, however, the most important determinant of meaning is the order of words, individually or in groups. The contrast can be summed up this way. In Latin, you can tell your friend that she has hit the nail on the head by saying rem acu tetigisti or tetigisti acu rem. But in English, you cannot perform the same linguistic operation without severe systematic consequences. There is a considerable difference between saying that you hit the nail and saying that the nail hit you. Poets in English play incessantly with normal patterns of word order, thus creating a multitude of interesting, witty, logically, and subtle and often surprising effects requiring us to ponder parallels between words and groups of words, sometimes more widely separated from each other than they would be in an ordinary prose statement. Some poets in English use syntactic arrangements in ways that challenge the reader's expectations about word order. Alternatively or additionally, some poets build sentences with multiple parts more complexly related to each other than they would be in the most modern English speech or writing. To participate in the syntactic games poets typically play, we need some shared terms for describing the elements that poets arrange in orderly, but also apparently disorderly, fashion. Page 2055. Parts of syntax. Parts of syntax, sentences, and words. The first rule of the poetic game of syntax, as it is represented in an anthology like this one, which includes a wide range of poems written at many times in many forms of English, is that most poets use the grammatical unit called the sentence as a major unit of the meaning, along with, but often in counterpoint to, the unit of the poetic line or the unit of the stanza. See versification p.2040. The sentence is the largest meaning bearing unit of a syntax, while the word is the smallest. Neither unit can be easily defined. This is so because both sentences and words can be compounded and divided in various ways that become more complex the more closely we look at them. Across the arc of history. Because English has changed so much over time, in other words, we can't safely assume that modern rules apply in centuries old text. As best we can, we need to bring history into our readings. Sentences are sometimes defined as units that have subjects and predicates. In the simplest cases, a noun subject and a predicate consisting only of a verb, Jill runs. In the most common type of English sentence, a noun working as a subject is followed by a verb, which leads to and conceptually affects acts on a noun, which may or may not be modified and which is called a direct object. The bird eats the worm, or more elaborately, Edwin Muir's The grasses threw straight shadows far away. Childhood, p. 1337. In a second very common sentence type, the subject is followed by a predicate that complements, refers back to, the subject. In this kind of sentence, the verb is usually a form of to be or seem to be, and there is no direct object. Instead, a predicate complement tells us something about the subject, as in the first line of Dryden's Macflint No. p.1 p.517. All human beings are subject to decay. Another example is T.S. Eliot's line, I am not Prince Hamlet, nor was meant to be. The love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, p.1343. Yet another is A.R. Emmons' wonderful opening to Pet Panther, p.1700. My attention is a wild animal. This type of sentence lends itself to reflection about identity and to the metaphor making. In yet a third type of sentence, the subject is followed by a verb that takes neither a direct object nor a predicate complement, because they neither act on a direct object nor reflect back on the subject. Such verbs are called transitive. Money talks, for example, or Jill faints. A more elaborate example comes again from Eliot. The winter evening settles down, with smell of sticks in passageways. Preludes. Some verbs are always intransitive, while others can be intransitive or transitive. If a duck flies overhead, the verb is intransitive. If I fly my plane to Reno, the verb is transitive. When in doubt, check the dictionary. Some modern poets and philosophers prefer sentences with transitive verbs to all others. Indeed, early in the last century, a philosopher named Ernst Fenollosa, who was a student of Chinese poetry and a major influence on Ezra Pound, urged poets writing in English to strive for correctness by avoiding the verb to be and intransitive verbs, arguing that the transfer of power is a basic truth of nature. Fenollosa maintained that the proper work of poetic syntax is to show an agent, subject, performing an act, transitive verb, on a subject, as in the farmer pounds rice. Dave, Articulate Energy, 36. Page 2056. Poetic Syntax. Fenollosa's theory can be contested on many counts, but it has the virtue of helping us understand why even those modern English language poets who seem to wage war on the rules of grammar and punctuation nonetheless rely on the traditional subject, verb, direct object, sentence as a basic building block of their poems. This is so paradoxically even in cases where the poem does not seem to include full sentences. See nominal syntax below p.2060. Because poets know that competent readers of English expect sentences, poets can assume that readers will work to create a sentence even when none seem to exist at the first glance. Such work, which can also be seen as play, occurs when we reread the line of Pope quoted at the beginning of this essay. Ganst pals, Mars, Latona, Hermes, arms. Why do even eventually decide that arms is a verb and not a noun? In this poetic sentence, which is a chock full of inert proper names and which does not give us a verb where we would normally expect it to be. The answer, or one answer, is that Pope expects us to resolve the confusion of his fighting gods into a kind of peace, the sense offered by the sentence, aided by a knowledge of syntax. We can see not only that arms in this line functions as a verb, but also that it functions retroactively as it were serving as the intransitive verb for both parts of the statement. We can translate it into prose as Mars, arms against Pallas, Hermes arms against Latona. Armed with a knowledge of syntax and willing to expend time on translating or paraphrasing Pope's impacted statement, we can win meaning from this odd arrangement of words. Although some poets and English teachers, such as Fenellosa's preference for sentences with a subject, an active verb, and a direct object. Many poets vary their sentence structures to capture different shades of thought about action and passion, and to create subtly varied rhythms. Consider, for example, the opening stanza of Kenneth Coke's Permanently, p.1691, which illustrate all basic three types of English sentence structure and conclude with special praise for one of them. Can you identify each type? One day the noun were clustered in the street. An adjective walked by with a dark beauty. The nouns were stuck, moved, changed. The next day a verb drove up and created the sentence. As Coke's line reminds us, many sentences are little narratives in them. Something happens, a story is told. Time passes in a consequential way. At the end we pause, and that pause has been signaled in writing since the late Middle Ages with a period. This mark is a graphic equivalent of a drop in the voice or a time for breathing between thoughts. The word period has many historical meanings. One denotes the sentence itself. Another denotes a particular kind of sentence, in which several subordinate clauses build toward a main clause. Clauses. A clause is a verbal unit that may look like, may even be, a sentence because both contain subjects and predicates. Jill runs home is both a clause. Line 1, subject plus predicate complement. Nouns / were clustered. Line 2, subject plus intransitive verb. Adjective / walked by. Line 3, subject plus predicate complement. Nouns / were struck, move, changed. Line 4, subject plus intransitive verb. Verb / drove up and subject plus transitive verb plus direct object. Verb / created / the sentence. Page 2057. Parts of syntax. And a sentence. But we understand the sentence to be the larger or containing unit and a clause to be the smaller or component unit. This is because a sentence may contain more than one clause. The periodic sentence mentioned above has one main or independent clause or any number of subordinate clauses. When she remembered the time, which she did when the bell rang, Jill ran home. Some sentences have two or more main clauses, although in such cases the term main, again, or independent loses some of its conventional meaning. Clauses in such sentence are coordinate and therefore, in truth, only semi-independent. They are sometimes connected by a certain punctuation mark other than the period. Today, independent clauses are usually yoked by the semicolon. But in older writing, the colon often connects clauses that are independent, but nonetheless closely related. Alternatively, such clauses may be connected by coordinating conjunctions such as and, but, so, for. An example of such a conjunction occurs in Denis Leverteux's poem The Closed World. The house dash snake dwells here still, under the threshold, but for months I have not seen it. A subordinate clause has a subject and a predicate, but cannot stand alone in or as a sentence. Such clauses appear in various positions in complex sentences. Some precede, others follow a main clause, and some are embedded in main clause in ways that blur the grammatical and conceptual distinction between independence and dependence. Subordinate clauses often elaborate, qualify, or even undermine an idea or image in the main clause. In many English poems, clauses are building blocks of thought that invite the reader to look back at the beginning of the sentence, to do a mental double take in order to grasp the logical relations among a sentence multiple parts. Subordinate clauses may play syntactic roles similar to those played by three parts of speech: the noun, the adverb, and the adjective. Modern handbooks of grammar will give you full list of joining words that typically introduce the different kinds of subordinate clauses. Adverbial clauses, for instance, usually follow subordinating conjunctions such as after, although, as if, because, whether, while. Shakespeare's sonnet 106 p.265 begins with such an adverbial clause. When the chronicle of wasted time / I see description of fairest whites. Adjectival clauses modifying a noun or pronoun are typically introduced by relative pronouns: that, which, who, whom, whose, or by relative adverbs: when, where, why. Shakespeare's sonnet 116 let me not to the marriage of true minds. p.266 use an adjectival clause in its second main clause. Love is not love. Shakespeare writes, which alters when its alteration finds. Here the subordinate clause follows and explains the contradictory proposition of the main clause. A good example, by the way, of the kind of predicate complement clause that Fenollosa thought poems should avoid. The line illustrates not only an adjectival clause at work but also the complex relation that can exist between main and subordinate clauses. When we read Shakespeare's line carefully, we mentally reorder the syntactic elements to place the subordinate or dependent from the Latin pantry hanging clause between rather than after the subject and its predicate complement, which is of course also love. The same word but in different. Page 2058. Poetic syntax. Syntactic function, if we visualize this main clause and dependent one, only part of a much longer sentence in the sonnet, we could diagram the relationship this way. Love, which alters when its alteration finds, is not love. Such diagramming, which reminds us that in Latin sub means beneath, can often be a useful tool for sorting out relation among syntactic parts of poems. For a fine example of such diagramming, see James Wynn's rendering of the opening sentence of Milton's Paradise Lost, which Linda Gregerson reproduces and trenchantly discusses in Anatomizing Death 105. Adjective and adverbial clauses are fairly easy to discern because they modify a noun, pronoun, or verb in the main clause and can be diagrammed as hanging from, depending on, a word in the main clause. Noun clauses are harder to spot. They can be introduced by relative pronouns and also by other pronouns, such as whoever, whomever, what, whatever, whichever. Moreover, noun clauses can follow many of the same subordinating conjunctions that signal adverbial clauses. The key to identifying noun clauses is to understand their syntactic function in the poetic sentence which we are working. Noun clauses may subjects, direct objects, objects of prepositions, or predicate complements. But they always appear in statements that cannot stand alone. Sometimes, however, we have to exacerbate these clauses because the poet has omitted the joining or articulating words that would help us see the poem's syntactic skeleton clearly. If we know how the clauses are working syntactically, however, we can catch them. There are many rewards to doing so. Let's consider Shakespeare's sonnet 106 p265 as an illustration of how a poet uses interplay among clauses to make meaning. In the version below, to clarify the poem structure, we have put the beginnings of main clauses, introductory words followed by subjects and verbs. In bold, we have put the beginning of the subordinate clauses in italic. When, in the Chronicle of the Wasted Time, I see description of fairest wights and beauty making beautiful old rhyme, in praises of ladies dead and lovely knights. Then in bold, in the blazon of sweet beauty's best, of hand, of foot, of lip, of eye, of brow, I see in bold their antique pen would have expressed even such a beauty as you master now. So in bold, all their praises are in bold, but prophecies of this our time, all you prefiguring and in bold, for they looked but with divining eyes. They had not, in bold, skill enough your worth to sing. For we, in bold, which now behold these present days, have, in bold, eyes to wonder, but lack, in bold, tongues to praise. Finding the main clause or clauses in the first step in analyzing this or any poem, having found the poem's head and torso as it were, we can proceed. Page 2059, Parts of Syntax, to finding the subordinate clauses, which can be compared to the poem's limbs, whether the body arises into new life depends in the part on who is reading it. How? In this sonnet, we have to wait patiently for the main clause to appear. I see in line 7, and when it does, we may not recognize it, for its thought as well as its syntax seem, paradoxically, to depend on those of the initial dependent clause. Although the when, then structure embodies a careful balance of ideas, each clause gets exactly 4 lines. The second clause is the main clause. When sets up expectations for the thought to be completed, and it is completed, albeit in a way that the rest of the sonnet elaborates and qualifies. We have found the main subject and verb, and we may well expect to find a direct object too. We do, momentarily, in the phrase their antique pen, but the syntax soon asks us to correct that idea, for the image of the pen is followed by a verb phrase that makes the pen the subject of a new little story. I see that the antique pen would have expressed even such a beauty. Experienced reader will add that the missing related pronoun automatically, but even they will have to engage in subliminal revision, reversing the usual forward motion of reading, left to right, on the page of a text in English. What advantage is there to recognizing the first main clause's direct object as a subordinate noun clause? Doing so helps us see that the object the poet finally sees in his main clause is not really an object, a thing at all. Instead, what the Shakespearean speaker sees here and elsewhere in his sonnets is an amazing blending of past and present, of certainly and suppositions, a constructed object rather than a natural one. The main clause and exfoliating direct object, does work to tell us about the speaker's way of seeing as well as about what he sees. This may interest us as readers because what the speaker is seeing arises from its interpretation of meanings located in old books. They are to him as he is to us, considered in relation to his present and by implication his future. In line 8, we need to excavate or co create another subordinate clause to make sense of the sonnet, as we needed to supply that to see the noun clause serving as the direct object of I see, so we also need to supply missing words to line 8 to make it work. Even such a beauty as the one that you master now. This subordinate clause functioning both to rename and to describe the beauty. This is the direct object of the noun clause functioning as a direct object of I see. Blurs the traditional distinction between adjectival and noun clause. Thus, the syntax, particularly the interplay of main and subordinate clauses, contributes to the poem's larger meditation on themes of mastery, competition, and relations of interdependence between past and present, lover and beloved, writer and reader, subject and the object of seeing. In the last 6 lines, we have more main clauses than in the first 8, and they come more rapidly and briefly in the final couplet. They are introduced by coordinating conjunction that, when singled out, help us see the logical skeleton of the poet's thought. So, and, for, note. Finally, that the embedded subordinate clause in line 11 may fool us into thinking it a main clause. For, after all, introduces a main clause just 2 lines later. Upon close analysis, however, we see that the group of words introduced by the first 4 works adverbially to modify the verb phrase that comes in the next.
Page 2060. For is therefore clause translated as because by this anthology's editors, not because they have access to some mysterious dictionary unavailable to readers, but rather because they have decoded the poem's syntax and come to the conclusion, as you can too, that line 11 after and both interrupts and helps explain the poet's claim that his predecessors lacked the skill to praise the speaker's beloved because they could see him or her only by divining or imagining him or her. Distinguishing between main and subordinate clauses is not always easy, but it is an important skill for players of the syntax game. Equipped with terms for describing syntactic element precisely, we can turn now to other moves poets make with sentences and with readers' expectation about them. Moves in the game. Syntax operates as a kind of promise or contract of expectation between poet and the reader, so the use of subordinate clauses to delay a main verb can function as a kind of tease. Milton, for instance, at the opening of Paradise Lost, page 421, and William Collins at the opening of Ode to Evening, page 675, give us main lines of complexly interrelated subordinate clauses to ponder and remember before we reach the main verb of the first poetic sentence. In Milton's epic, the imperative verb sing arrives after 5 lines. In Collins' ode, the imperative verb phrase now teach me arrives only in line 15. After many stranded subordinate clause, beginning if ought, in which the poem seems to attempt to prove to his addressee, the evening personified as Eve, that his own pastoral song has the power to soothe thy modest ear. Poets' relations to their readers are often figured in terms of pleas and commands addressed to a muse, a source of inspiration traditionally gendered female and often addressed as thou. In both Milton and Collins' poems, the exquisitely delayed arrival of the main verb challenges the readers to participate in the poem's game of call and response over a space of time epitomized by the sentence's prolonged unfolding. Milton's opening sentence points back to the Genesis and forward to Christ's second coming. Collins' opening sentence comes back to Milton's while also mimicking the gradual coming of evening in a northern English latitude. The romantic poet Hannah More, meanwhile, provides an interesting variant on the syntactic pattern of the Miltonic invocation. The poem's opening address to a muse, by addressing an ungendered and plural set of muses, airy spirits, in line 1 of her inscription in a beautiful retreat called Fairy Bower, page 707. While delaying her main verb come to line 7, in other poems the verb doesn't come at all. Nominal syntax. Consider, for example, this very short poem by Ezra Pound, in the station of the metro. The apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bow, giving us two noun phrases but no verb. Pound's poem illustrates that what some critics have called nominal syntax, the use of noun phrases in a way that asks the reader to make conceptual or emotional connections between the poem's syntactic parts. Kyoto 322. In a station of the metro derives from Pound's appropriation of the ancient Japanese haiku for the modern imaginist movement. But if we read these three lines carefully and with some knowledge of syntactic traditions in English language poetry, we see that Pound not only provides us with striking images but also plays creatively with poetic tradition of the delayed opening verb, which is itself related to the oratorical tradition of periodic sentences aimed at keeping the audience in a state of suspense. Pound's poem figuratively has us wait in a French subway station for a verb that never arrives. If, however, we play the poet's syntactic game by supplying some conceptual or emotional link between the poem's two major images, which seem to come from two very different worlds, on the one hand, that this bustling city, on the other hand, that of nature, or perhaps of nature as represented in Japanese art, we will have played a role traditionally ascribed to the poet's muse, that of the setting poet's train of thoughts in motion. As Pound's poem suggests, even modern poets who used various techniques of sentences fragmentation to challenge poetic tradition as well as conventions of ordinary language use presuppose that the reader knows sentence rules well enough to appreciate meanings created by expectations are not fulfilled. Such poets dramatize the notion mentioned above of syntax as a kind of contract between poet and the reader. Their shared knowledge of rules, like soccer players' knowledge of the moves in their game, is often barely conscious until it is analyzed, as in a slow speed replay. And for readers, as for athletes, now knowledge often comes when we feel that rules have been bent or broken, and we stop to ask what's wrong. In the opening stanza of Since Feeling is First, page 1394, E. Cummings seems to justify the breaking of syntactic and other language use rules. Since feeling is first, who pays any attention to the syntax of things will never wholly kiss you. But what is Cummings really saying about paying or not paying attention to the syntax of things? He is using an old and important poetic technique, what the critic William Emerson calls double syntax, to make two quite different statements in this four-line unit ending with a semicolon, a punctuation mark that we have seen typically signals the end of a main clause. Double syntax. This occurs when a phrase, line, or group of lines can be read in two different ways in relation to the syntax that precedes or follows the unit. In many examples of double syntax, the poet gives us an apparently complete thought in a syntactic unit that appears to be an independent clause, but then goes on to revise the thought, often in a witty or paradoxical way, by showing us that unit we thought was complete in a part of a larger and usually more conceptually challenging syntactic structure, often a sentence. In Cummings, since feeling is first, the first three lines can be interpreted by complex sentences with a subordinate adverbial clause followed by a main one. The statement emphasizes with rhetorical question, a consequence of apparently logical opening premise. We can make sense of the first three lines by adding a question mark after line 3 and paraphrasing them thus: because feeling comes first, that is most important in a scale of values. Who in her or his right mind would pay any attention to the syntax, orderly or logical arrangement of things? The question is rhetorical because it assumes a simple answer that everyone agrees on. Such questions are often used to simplify, to imply that everyone conse- consents to idea that might well merit questioning and even dissent. Cummings undermines his own poem's rhetorical questions as also the coercive logic of its initial clause. When in line 4, he offers a phrase that seems at first a sentence of fragment jarringly unrelated to the first three lines. If, however, we pay attention to Cummings' sentence syntax, we will go back and reread the first three lines in the light of the new thought given in line 4. We can then paraphrase a line to a whole this way: since feeling comes first, logically, and in this poem, temporary too, he or she who pays attention to the syntax of things will never kiss you fully or totally. The second, fuller reading requires us to supply a pronoun subject before the word who. That word thus becomes a relative pronoun as the opening lines change from asking a simple and arguably simplistic rhetorical questions into making a more syntactically complex statement. Word order inversions. Many poetic ambiguities, including many of those in simple or of double syntax, arise from inversions of the basic transitive sentence, subject or verb or object. The most common of these changes places the direct objects before the verb and subject. A curious knot God made in paradise. Edward Taylor writes, for example, at the beginning of his Upon Wedlock and Death of Children, page 537, had Taylor used normal verse order for this opening clause, God made a curious knot in paradise, he would have lost the opportunity to establish a meaningful and visually striking parallel between his title's first noun wedlock and the word knot in his opening line. By putting wedding and knot into parallel positions, Taylor sets the stage for the conceptual definition of knot as marriage, but by inverting normal word order to achieve the parallelism, he also subtly introduces another meaning of knot develops in the poem, not as a puzzle, as something that challenges reason and even faith in God's providential plan. Note the pun on knot and knot. Here, as in many poems, word order inversion allows a poet to emphasize a certain idea or image by giving it pride of place. The inversion, often accompanied by interesting rhymes and rhythms, works to provoke thought. In many of the older poems in this anthology, lines that may may seem completely obscure at first become clear, even witty, when we unscramble a word order inversion. John Donne's famous poem commanding his mistress to undress and make love to him begins, for instance, with the following independent clause: Come, madam, come, all rest my powers defy. If we try to read a sentence that uses most common English pattern, subject, verb, direct object, we will be perplexed for how can one's rest defy one's powers. If we work at the syntax, however, we will see that the verb form offers a clue that an inversion is occurring here. Defy goes agrees with the plural subject, not a singular one. You wouldn't say, my cat defy my dog. Mentally rearranging Dunn's word order, we arrive at a clause that is both grammatically correct and brilliant introduction to the poem's body, boasting humor. My powers defy all rest. Rest, we see, turns out to be the direct object, not the subject of the statement. The subject, in terms of grammar but also of theme, is speaker's powers, which, he says, defy or resist either as sleep or masculine slackness. The poem goes on to develop an intricate association, a curious knot, between a man's sexual powers and his verbal powers of persuasion. Edmund Spenser also uses word order inversion to create witty effects that have some serious metaphysical implications. Early in his epic poem, The Fairy Queen, 1.1.8 to 9, page 16, one- 167, he describes his young, inexperienced hero this way: Fully jolly knight he seemed, a fair did sit, as one for knightly gusts and fierce encounters fit. The first clause we see is a sentence of the type which is classified as predicate complement using normal English word order to make the same point, we could say that he seemed a very jolly, that is, gallant and cheerful knight. Putting the sentence this way, performing the operation known as paraphrasing is critical to understanding not only Spencer's syntax but also some of the larger themes of the Protestant epic. Indeed, syntax, which in this case requires us to think twice about our first impression of how the hero looks as a soldier, is one of the Spencer's main tools for warning the reader not to take appearances as truth. In Spencer's Protestant poem, syntax often worked to dramatize the value of faith in an invisible reality. Such faith is accompanied by, indeed grows from, a distrust of sensory impressions in general and of visual images in particular. Advancing his lesson in iconoclasm and distrust of images, Spencer crafts a sentence in which we first see the words for jolly knight, then we get the sentence's grammatical subject he, and then we get a verb that creates irony at the hero's expense that uh, retroactively questioning the fit between the hero's appearance and his inward state of readiness for religious battle. In the narrative that follows, the hero will repeatedly fall into error by believing first impressions. In Spencer's poem, as many others in this anthology, syntactic inversion acquires resonance when considered along with historical, philosophical, religious, and other determinants of the meaning. In his Elegy Adonis 31 to 34, page 880, for example, Percy by Shelley uses words order inversion in the course of raising some broad questions about theology, history, and politics. Questions that require us to move from text to context in interpreting syntactically difficult lines. In them, Shelley describes the poet John Milton as blind, old, and lonely when his country's pride, the priest, the slave, and the liberticide, trampled and mocked with many a loathed right. Which of the nouns preceding the transitive verbs is the subject of the subordinate clauses beginning when with when, and which is the object? Two patterns of poetic inversion, subject object verb or object subject verb, are most common in metrical English poetry. Is the pride of the country is performing the actions of trampling and mocking the priest, the slave, and the liberticide, that is the killer of the liberty. Or are the three figures mentioned in the passage second line trampling and mocking the kind of pride in his country that Milton felt? We can't solve this puzzle unless we go beyond syntax. Just of these lines to learn something about Milton and about Shelley's views of his precursor, who was finally on the losing side of the English Civil War and who was announced as a regicide king killer by some of his enemies. Once we know that Shelley shared Milton's love of liberty and his scorn for the rights of the established English church and state, we can see that the second paraphrase given above is distinctly preferable to the first. The priest, slave, and the liberticide trampled and mocked Milton's pride in his country. We can also now see the another possible reading of the lines. The phrase when his country's pride can describe Milton, a meaning that shifts our understanding of what is subordinate, what a main clause is here. We can, that is, also paraphrase these lines as saying that the priest, the slave, and the liberticide trampled and mocked Milton when he was his country's pride, and they did so with many a loathed right. Shelley's syntax is famously fluid. Indeed, some have denounced it as incoherent. Others have defended it by arguing that Shelley's poetry creates the vocabulary and syntax of a new vision of reality, Simpson 82. For both philosophical and political reasons, Shelley wanted to blur traditional distinctions between subjects and objects. His syntax reflects that interest. In the case we have just examined, the syntactic obstacles to immediate comprehension dramatize the ongoing competition between different political views of the liberty in England and challenge the reader to resolve the competition in a way that rejects one possible reading to respect consonant others more consonant with what we can glean from many sources about Shelley's and Milton's view of liberty. Because the significant ambiguities in a poem's syntax may be historically motivated, they often send us to other poems by same author. Other poems by author we know or suspect that a poet read, and even to the larger texts of history that include ongoing political, theological, and literary debates. Ambiguities of poetic syntax also invite us to reconsider other meaningful aspects of poems such as rhythm, stanza forms, line breaks, and punctuation. These phenomena are no less important to poems we hear read aloud or sung than they are to the poems we encounter primarily through the eye. But when we read poems on the page, we necessarily confront the myriad ways in which printers and editors in tandem and with the poem's original author shape what we see. In a perception of some poetic ambiguities depends on the presence or absence of judgments by other readers about, for instance, punctuation marks and spelling. With older poems in particular, punctuation marks may represent a printer's or an editor's interpretation of a line. Conventions of punctuation have changed over time, and the meaning of punctuation is always open to interpretation, whether or not we possess a material text thought to represent an author's intent, which in any case may have changed in his or her own lifetime as a reader of his or her own poems. In any case, it is appropriate to end this introduction to poetic syntax with some brief examples of syntactic analysis linked to questions about punctuation, about the poem's mode of being as a reproducible material object, and about acts of interpretation, including those of editors and other readers as moves in a game without closure. The Game of Interpretation, Emily Dickinson. When poems exist in multiple manuscript versions, editors necessarily make interpretive decisions about syntax simply by deciding which version to print. This is strikingly the case for editors of Emily Dickinson, since Dickinson published few of her poems during her life and left almost 2,000 poems in various groupings, including more than 40 hand-bound booklets called fascicles, and in various drafts, kinds of drafts, including scrawls on the backs of envelopes at her death. Many poems exist in several different forms available at www.emilydickinson.org and in the various rum edition in the various edition by R. H. Franklin. In some Dickinson poems, the presence or absence of a certain punctuation mark contributes to rich opportunities for interpretive debate. Compare, for example, two versions of his poem, A Bird Come Down to Walk, number 359, 328, page 1116. In one version printed in R. H. Franklin Reading edition of Dickinson's poem, and in his anthology, the complex relation between the bird and the poem speaker, and I/I looking at the bird as the bird is looking at the speaker, is rendered as follows in third stanza and beginning of the fourth. He glanced with rapid eyes that hurried all abroad. They looked like frightened beads, I thought. He stirred his velvet head. Like one in danger, cautious, I offered him a crumb. In another version of his poem, however, a version printed is many modern anthologies. The transition between the third and fourth stanzas occurs without any punctuation. This editorial choice changes the poem's syntax and, in so doing, invites debates about how we perceive the relation between two creatures, the bird and the human speaker, caught in the act of looking at each other. He stirred his velvet head like one in danger, cautious. I offered him a crumb.